Let's discuss the seventh chapter that is related to Golden Jubilee of Bank Nationalization. Before I discuss the points given in this particular chapter, let me discuss the concept of the banking nationalization. Government of India in two runs or in 2 years conducted the concept of a bank nationalization. What is this idea of a nationalization of the banks? Please understand, earlier these particular banks were owned by the private sector or were private sector banks. In two rounds, that is one in the year 1969 and the second in the year 1980, Government of India started nationalizing these particular banks, or in simple terms, transferred the ownership from the private sector under the hands of the government itself. In the year 1969, we basically focused on 14 banks and nationalized these particular banks. And in the year 1980, we focused on 6 more banks and nationalized these particular banks. Now, some of you will have this doubt. Why specifically 14? Why specifically 6? Why not 15? Why not 10? So on and so forth. Please understand, the banks which were nationalized in the year 1969 as well as 1980 were nationalized based on one very important parameter, that is NDTL, Net Demand and Time Liabilities. In the year 1969, we nationalized all those particular private sector banks which had an NDTL of more than 50 crore rupees. And in the year 1980, we nationalized all those particular banks which had an NDTL of more than 200 crore rupees. So based on one parameter, that is the NDTL available with these particular banks, we basically took these particular private sector banks and nationalized these particular banks. Now, what was the problem? What were the objectives why we went for nationalization? First and foremost, these particular banks were private sector banks. And whenever you discuss anything related to private sector, their focus will always be on profit maximization, not on social welfare. Whereas when you discuss the concept of a public sector banks or those particular banks which are owned by Government of India, their primary focus or the only focus will not be on the profit maximization, rather they'll be focused even on social welfare. Let me give an example. More than 70% of the credit market in India is held by the public sector banks. And the public sector banks also account for majority of the non-performing assets, which we'll see later. But this being the case, any private sector bank would have basically withdrawn or taken into consideration these particular factors and started working on ensuring that there is a reduction of NPAs, non-performing assets, such as credit issue to sectors which account for huge number of NPAs. Best example, industries, private sector borrowers, MSME sector, so on and so forth. Whereas in case of India, since majority of these particular banks are owned by Government of India, rather than being focused only on the economic parameters or the financials such as profits, these particular banks are also focused on conducting social welfare measures such as issuing loans to the MSME sector under Pradhan Mantri Mudra Yojana, conducting loan melas so as to revive the consumption demand or consumption growth in the rural India, giving loans for export credit, giving loans for education sector, and giving loans for agriculture sector. So you can see that in case of the private sector banks, the focus is always on profits. Whereas in case of the public sector banks, primary focus is not profit. They also want to focus on the social welfare measures also. And this has been one of the reasons why the performance of the public sector banks has not been very satisfactory. However, back in the year 1969 as well as 1980, these particular banks were private sector banks. And since these are private sector banks, their focus was only on profits. Government of India said that rather than being focused only on profits, we want to achieve certain social welfare objectives. Hence, we went for nationalization. Second, the concentration of these particular banks, that is the private sector banks, was majorly in bigger cities. Now, since these particular banks were made as a nationalized banks or were converted as nationalized banks, the concentration was skewed. Or since these particular banks were converted from private sector banks to the banks owned by Government of India, the concentration was spread across. And since these particular banks were converted from private sector banks to public sector banks, now they had to open up the branches all across the cities as well as villages. Now, apart from this, another very important reason for nationalization was to ensure credit availability for borrowers in the market. That is specifically borrowers such as agriculture sector, small businesses, so on and so forth. And if you see the time period, especially the first round of nationalization was conducted during the concept of a green revolution itself. And to promote the idea of a green revolution, one of the very important parameter that was required was accessibility to institutional credit. So government of India, keeping in mind all these particular objectives, went for nationalization of the banking sector, or basically converted the ownership or transferred the ownership from the private sector to the government itself. Now, these are some of the points related to nationalization of the banking sector. Now, what this economic survey discusses? Economic survey, first and foremost, says though there are large number of banks in India, these particular banks are not competitive in the international market. And this particular point is discussed under the concept of dwarfism in the banking sector in India. First and foremost, economic survey says a large number of banks are present in India, but none of these particular banks, except one, feature in the 100 biggest banks in the global level. That is, economic survey says, when I compare the economy size of India, India is the fifth largest economy in the world. But when I compare that with the number of large banks which are present in India, except one, none of the Indian banks feature in the top 100 biggest banks in the world. Compare that with China. China, no doubt, is one of the largest economies in the world. But more importantly, the survey says China has 18 biggest banks out of 100 biggest banks in the global market. So when I compare the size of the economy with the size of the banks, there is a disproportionate representation of Indian banking sector at the global level. Now you will have a doubt. Why these particular banks are important? Why should we have bigger banks? Why not have large number of smaller banks? Please understand, any economy you study which has evolved over a period of time, especially the developed economies, these particular developed economies, the growth in these particular economies has been fueled by larger banks or bigger banks. And whenever you have these kind of a bigger banks, they will not only compete in the domestic market, they will also give a very tough competition to other banks in the international market. They will finance infrastructure projects, which is majorly required in case of India. For example, in case of infrastructure, we say that these particular projects will have a high sunken cost and high gestation period. Now, what do you mean by this? Let me elaborate on this. If I want to construct a 100-kilometer stretch of a national highway, I need to invest heavily in these particular infrastructure projects. A single project will require huge amount of investment to be done. Don't you think bigger banks, if they are present in India, they will find it very easier to finance these kind of infrastructure projects? First point. Second point, when I invest in such an infrastructure project, the returns will not be given to me immediately or tomorrow itself. For the road construction to be done, it will take many years. So we say that for infrastructure projects, the time that is required for this particular project to start generating revenues is very, very long. This technically is called as high gestation period. So infrastructure projects will incur huge sunken cost as well as will have huge gestation period. In case of India, since these particular banks are not big banks, since these particular banks do not have huge amount of a capital available with them, when I compare them with global banks, they will find it very difficult to provide financing for infrastructure projects. And government of India, or for that matter, any economist will tell you, one of the ways of having growth as well as the development in any of the economy is to invest heavily in infrastructure. For example, very recently in the month of December itself, Government of India has announced that they want to have a total investment of 102 lakh crore rupees in infrastructure. Now, what is the objective of this kind of investment? They want to ensure there is growth as well as the development, employment generation, contribution to the manufacturing. The sectors which are involved in this particular infrastructure will get the benefit from all these particular infrastructure project, credit offtake to increase in the market, so on and so forth. The problem in case of India is we do not have the bigger banks when I compare these particular banks in the global market. Only one bank features from India in the top 100 banks in terms of the size of the banks, that is State Bank of India. Whereas in case of China, as already mentioned, they have 18 banks in the top 100 banks. Second, since the public sector banks control majority of the market share in the banking sector, I will take the credit offtake or credit issued by these particular public sector banks as a proxy to whole banking sector. So the problem is credit access to the private sector is disproportionate. All the private sector entities do not get the same access to credit in the market. Third issue has been of credit growth. As per economic survey, credit growth since 2013 has been on declining trend. That is, to prove this, they have given a data related to NPBs, that is new private sector banks. And whenever I use the term new private sector banks, these were the banks which were given licenses post 1993 in case of India. So new private banks, the credit offtake in these particular banks has increased between 15% and 29% between 2010 to 2019. Whereas in case of public sector banks, the credit growth in these particular public sector banks has been in single digits after 2014, and in the year 2019 the credit growth has increased by only 4%. Now why this is a problem? As already mentioned, majority of the credit market is controlled or is accounted by the public sector banks, and during a period of a slowdown we want the credit offtake of these particular banks to increase in the market rather than having an increased trend of credit offtake. Majority of the participants who are public sector banks, their credit offtake is very low. The importance of this is this. They discuss a concept of a virtuous cycle. Now, what do you mean by virtuous cycle? We expect the banks to issue more loans at a lesser rate of interest. And when loans at a very low rate of interest are available in the market, companies will take large number of loans. And when companies take large number of loans, employment is expected to increase, production is expected to increase, supply to the market is expected to increase. So on one side, employment is getting created, means what? Salaries, wages will increase, and on the other side, supply to the market for goods and services is also going to increase. So there is higher income generation, there is higher supply. Higher income generation will lead to higher demand for goods and services in the market. When demand for goods and services will increase, production will increase, again employment will increase. Overall, the GDP growth rate will increase. This is referred as a virtuous cycle of a growth which is expected to be promoted by credit offtake at a very cheaper rate of interest by these particular banks. Rather than this being the situation, there is a worry or a concern that the offtake of the credit is not up to the expected levels, or this particular rate of a growth of offtake of a credit will not lead to this kind of a virtuous cycle which is needed in case of Indian economy. So this is discussed under the concept of a dwarfism in the banking sector. Now what is the issue with the public sector banks? The survey has quoted or has listed some of the issues that is plaguing the public sector banks. First and foremost, the collective loss of the public sector banks have amounted to more than 66,000 crore rupees in the recent year. This particular number is a problem for the PSBs, because please understand, PSBs have accounted for majority of the deposits collected by the bank, which means in PSBs, common man's money is deposited. When the performance of the PSBs is very poor, the quality of these particular deposits will also take a hit, or the investors' confidence in the performance of the PSBs will also take a hit. Now, second, PSBs collectively account for 85% of the reported bank frauds. Third, the gross NPAs in case of public sector banks equal to 7.4 lakh crore rupees in the year 2019. And overall NPAs in the banking sector were around 10 lakh crore rupees, which means over 80% of the NPAs are concentrated in public sector banks itself. Now, what do you mean by NPA? NPA stands for non-performing asset. In simple terms, here is a bank which has given loan to a customer or a borrower in the market. If the borrower repays the loan, such an asset is called as a standard asset. Now, why I am using the term asset? Please think from the perspective of a bank. For a bank, the loan that they have issued, which will fetch them the earnings, are assets. And on the other side, banks have collected deposits which have to be repaid by the bank. Hence, the deposits are called as liabilities. So the loans which are issued or the advances that are issued by the banks will fetch them returns. Hence these are called as assets. And when such an asset in this particular context doesn't get any returns to the bank, it is called as a non-performing asset. Of course, I've given you the very layman definition of an NPA. Technically, RBI says if the repayment of the loan is not done even after the end of 90 days from the due date, such an asset will be classified as a non-performing asset. I'll repeat the statement. If the repayment of the loan is not done even after the end of 90 days from the due date, such an asset will be classified as a non-performing asset. So the number of non-performing assets are very, very high. The PSBs account for around or more than 80% of the NPAs in the banking sector. The total value of NPAs are to the tune of 7.4 lakh crore rupees. And whenever NPAs will increase, there are certain issues which will plague the banks. For example, the returns which are earned by the banks will be very, very less. This is the reason why they have incurred a huge amount of a loss. Second, investor confidence will take a hit. Third, the lending activities of the banks will also be affected by these particular NPAs. What do you mean by this? One, as a bank realize that there is one sector which is taking a large number of loans, but they are becoming NPAs, my exposure to the sector will come down in the subsequent years. For example, industries. So the industrial credit offtake will get affected. Second, within the concept of credit itself, since last couple of years, many of my assets have become NPAs. In this year, I want to ensure that I will not only recover some of the earnings that I've lost because of NPAs, I want to ensure these accounts will remain as standard asset. So what will I do? I will be very picky in terms of giving loans to the borrowers, and whenever I give a loan, the rate of interest that I'm going to charge will be very, very high. This will basically lead to crowding out. Problem is, if I'm a genuine borrower in the market and the bank, in order to basically recover its NPS, is charging a higher rate of interest. Why should I pay a higher rate of interest? Because somebody else has defaulted in the market. So rather than borrowing from the bank, I as a company might look at other sources of borrowing. For example, NBFCs. For example, issuing bonds or commercial papers in the market. Or I can even go to the foreign market and bring the loans under the concept of external commercial borrowings. So crowding out might happen, or genuine borrowers may move away from the banking sector. Apart from this, 4.3 lakh crore rupees has been put in by the government in the banking sector in the form of equity. Government of India is basically conducting a process called as a recapitalization process. Under this particular infusion of capital, Government of India has infused more than 4 lakh crore rupees into the public sector banks. Now you will have a doubt, sir, why this is a problem? It is a problem for a simple reason. This particular money that is infused by the government is not the money of Government of India. Government of India would have borrowed from the market, or in other cases, Government of India has collected taxpayers' money and has infused this particular money into the banking sector. Now various taxpayers will simply ask this question: why don't you utilize this same money to construct a road, or to provide subsidy for us, or to invest in any other infrastructure? Why do you want to infuse capital into the banks which have made a decision to give loan to certain people who have defaulted? So it is a classic case of using good money for bad decision making. Or else some experts have said that by infusing capital into these particular public sector banks and not holding them accountable, Government of India itself is promoting bad behavior in the public sector banks. These have been the issues with respect to the idea of putting equity into this particular banking sector. And moreover, please understand, the money that is there with the Government of India is a very scarce resource. Government of India could have utilized this particular 4.3 lakh crore rupees for any other better use. Rather than using this particular 4 lakh plus crore rupees for anything else, they have infused that into the public sector banks. And what is the guarantee that the PSBs will improve their performance in the coming days? What if their performance deteriorates to much larger level in the next year? So will Government of India again infuse capital into the banking sector? So there have been the issues related to this particular decision. Last one, the government needs to recognize that certain social goals can also be achieved by other financial institutions. For example, the growth in the microfinancial institutions. So these particular social goals of Government of India can also be achieved by financial intermediation by many other financial institutions in the market. Why do you want to focus or push these particular social goals? By using only the public sector banks. So these have been certain issues with the performance of the public sector banks which have been quoted in the economic survey. Next, what is the way forward then? What should be done? What should be done in order to ensure these particular problems will be addressed? First and foremost, there is a need of investing in developing infrastructure which will leverage various data points such as credit scores, credit information, etc. In simple terms, we need to use the tools under information and technology to pull in various points of information or various points of a data so that the banks will be assisted in providing loans in the market. For example, earlier I've mentioned a concept called as CRILC, which stands for Central Repository of Information on Large Creditors. If these kind of tools were utilized, then the issue of NPAs to a certain extent would have been taken care of by the public sector bank. Second, presently the employees are risk averse because of various issues. Many of the times it has been found that the employees do not want to take a risky decision because of various points of concern, such as what if I take a decision today and after a couple of years one of the investigating agencies of Government of India will evaluate my decision and come to a conclusion there were certain mistakes done by me. In that particular situation, they are going to come behind me. They are going to charge me with certain offenses. So to play safe, these particular employees are averse to taking risky decisions in the market. The economic survey says that one of the ways of ensuring that this will not happen in the coming days is 1. Make these particular employees as shareholders. Issue certain stake of these particular PSBs to these particular employees. Now, since these particular employees own certain stake in the PSB itself, their incentives or the returns that they get are directly linked to the performance of the bank. This will basically promote innovation as well as risky decision making in these particular employees. Third one, having lateral entry practices to attract the best talent. Please understand, today there are certain issues with respect to attracting talent or the best available talent in the market in the PSBs. Because since these are owned by Government of India, they are supposed to abide by certain guidelines in terms of hiring these particular people. Economic survey recommends that certain measures must be adopted in such a way that the best available talent in the market must be hired by these particular public sector banks. So these are some of the recommendations which have been provided by the economic survey. So these are the points in this particular chapter related to 50 years of nationalization in the banking sector.